During the past few years, African leaders have demonstrated an unprecedented commitment to advancing the regional integration project in Africa, and in particular, the negotiations on the African Continental Free Trade Area. We are indeed privileged today to have with us the Secretary General of the AfCFTA, Mr. Wamkele Mene. Wamkele, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Professor Ismail, for that really warm introduction. Thank you for inviting me to this session again. I think it's important that from time to time, that heads of states take stock of the work that we are doing, and that they remain engaged as drivers of Africa's economic development, and also that they provide us with the requisite political guidance where there may be a need for them to do so. We have to recognize that it is going to take us a long time to get to the point of a fully integrated and a fully industrialized continent. We know this from the experience of the European Union, that it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, and that it's very, very difficult work. It is particularly challenging where there are such stark differentials in levels of economic development, where there are such stark differentials in countries' industrial base, countries' manufacturing capacity on the African continent. And there are big questions about whether or not Africa can do this. I think all of us who believe in the African continent know that we can do it. We also know that it is going to take determined, resolute effort, decade after decade, of implementing a clear industrial development action plan. We have it within our capacity to do something, and to do something meaningful to improve Africa's industrial development capacity.
I'm very encouraged by the remarks of the Secretary General, which really emphasize action orientation. And I think that a lot of the discussion that we had during our session on pharmaceuticals really emphasized this as well. The Continental Free Trade Agreement is not an end in itself, but rather presents us with an opportunity for economic transformation and industrialization through building the productive capacity, promotion of economic diversification, structural transformation, and technological development. To fully develop the value chain, we will need to also look at both the supply side as well as the demand side constraints, such as energy, infrastructure, financing, production inputs, as well as the demand side constraints, such as government procurement, as well as the low purchasing power of consumers or patients. We've seen the world mobilize resources to deal with this pandemic. However, very little of those resources are actually coming to the African continent. And that's something that we really need to think about.
The AfCFTA provides an opportunity for enhancing the efficiency and international competitiveness of African cotton, textile, and clothing sector through development of the regional value chains. The point was made that Africa accounts for less than 1% of global textile and apparel trade. Therefore, there is a room for African countries to increase trade in these products. Nevertheless, the overall conclusion was that with the right policies and driven by progress in the AfCFTA, the sector could develop inward-oriented regional value chains, i.e. to supply African markets, and possibly also exports outside the region's global value chains.
The rising net food imports in Africa may reach $110 billion by 2025, indicating increased food demand and changing consumption patterns driven by population growth and urbanization. Therefore, there is room to increase local production and processing for intra-African trade to meet this demand. We need about 940 billion US dollars for cumulative global investments in sub-Saharan Africa's agriculture and its downstream support services. Unfortunately, only 10 African countries are ranked in the top 100 most competitive countries in the world in the 2018 Global Competitiveness Index. Furthermore, climate change poses a huge challenge for farmers and herders in Africa. African policymakers must avoid policy somersault and focus on engaging the smallholder farmers more effectively.
Policy possibilities is critical, and we have the right people to help us understand better and what to expect. In terms of these value chains, as we all know, over the last 4 decades, global value chains have become the main channels through which developing countries engage in international trade. African countries' participation in global value chains has been largely as suppliers of raw materials and primary products rather than increasingly higher value products, which means that by supplying these raw materials, their ranking in the global value chains is at the bottom of the chain as suppliers of low value added products.
Most of international financial institutions' data, they talk Africa, but in fact it's only about sub-Saharan Africa, which is important in a sense because it divides the continent at a time where we want to integrate it in terms of data and information systems. But there is a more substantive point to be made, which is the quality of data that we have available for us to be capable of basically have the good policies. And the proposals and the strategies have to be based on quality data that unfortunately is not always available. The number of countries with national accounts up to date continues to be slightly less than 20 in Africa, which means that we have a huge gap of information in terms of size of GDP, composition of the economy. We have also a problem of how we actually collect trade data, because a lot of informality in our relations, cross-border intra-Africa relations, ends up not being captured, like it is the case with a lot of other economic activities. So we have sort of an underestimation of the levels of integration that exists insofar as cross-border operations are already occurring. Our Secretary General Wamkele was very clear in saying that we need to focus. That's absolutely essential. That's what industrial policy is all about.
To me, if you have 38 countries growing above 3%, that's not bad. It's a good start. And if you also look at the general macroeconomic management, most African countries have not made the big mistakes that we used to see in the 70s and even the 80s, the big macroeconomic mistakes. I can't come up with any one country. People talk a lot about Zimbabwe, but we can discuss that if necessary. But in general, macroeconomic management has improved quite a bit. The huge problem, the fundamental macro problem, macro growth problem, is the fact that our economies have remained too dependent on commodities. The continental free trade area and trade in general is critical to Africa's moving forward and transforming itself. A big problem that African countries and developing countries in general have faced for decades is the fact that we tend to be enthusiastic about all kinds of industries, all kinds of sectors, including sectors in which we may not need to be in at this stage of development. To me, as a macroeconomist, as an African macroeconomist, the two most important variables that I worry about are the terms of trade and the real effective exchange rate. To me, these are the two most important macroeconomic variables, which really determine productivity levels. And I don't hear enough talked about this. So I think one of the key issues that the Secretary General should be focusing on should be the macroeconomics of trade in Africa, in small open economies. And I talked about the terms of trade. Let me say one word about the real effective exchange rate. Well, that's what determines your external competitiveness as you produce whatever you produce in your regional value chain.
I think that there is a compelling case for developing regional value chains in Africa. In addition to having high entry barriers, participation in global value chains may lock African countries into low value addition activities. Again, if you look at the data, Africa's participation in global value chains is estimated at about 2.2, maximum 2.5% of the entire total. I think also that regional value chains are more suited to industrialization in Africa because, of course, they promise more employment, the whole issue of labor-intensive methods, but also because they can be aligned to local needs. And I'll speak a bit to that later on. But take, for instance, the pharmaceutical industry and the fact that some of the diseases that plague Africa are tropical in nature, and therefore a lot of the research going into them and the amount of production going into them may not be focused on Africa's interests. Take, for instance, a disease like malaria. But I want to stress that regional value chains will not occur spontaneously, and nor can they be willed into existence by governments. They will come about through a deepening of industrialization, specialization, and a fragmentation of production processes. I think the Continental Free Trade Area can play an important role in this regard. I think an interesting approach to developing regional value chains might be to design regional industrial policies. I think a good example of the kind of policy regime that can be pushed under a free trade area comes from the Asean Free Trade Area, where they have the Asean Investment Cooperation Scheme. This is a scheme that enables a production agreement between at least two companies from at least two different countries in ASEAN in the manufacturing sector.
If you look at some of the things that the EAC has done, from the point of view of establishing an infrastructure facilitating environment, facilitating for trade, it's very, very important. And so we have already, in fact, started having conversations with the African Development Bank, with the Afrexim Bank, to see how, now that we have actually a legal instrument, what are some of the supporting and complementary measures for finance that can be taken. We should create an integrated market now on the African continent for all the things that we've been discussing: value chains development, infrastructure development, in enhancing investment on the African continent. That, to me, is the immediate challenge. And one thing that no regional economic community does have, which we have created, is a dispute settlement mechanism. This is really, really critical for our own investors in Africa to have confidence in what we are doing. It has a great deal of impact on a positive impact on how we address the challenge of lack of ease of doing business on the African continent. If our own African investors do not have confidence in the investment climate of our continent because there are no dispute settlement mechanisms, I don't think that we're going to succeed.
The whole purpose of these seminars, the whole aim and intention, I think, and common cause of all of us here, is that we want to see the Continental Free Trade Area become a tool of economic diversification and industrialization, moving up the value chain into higher value-added products. And I think that if that were to materialize, what we would start to see is that there would be not just a quantitative expansion expansion of intra-regional trade, but also a qualitative change in its character and composition. We would start to see products that were produced with inputs coming from several countries on the continent, being assembled probably in different locations on the continent.
So I hope that we are all ready to trade. But having said that, trade agreements can be as beautiful as they may appear. They may be very perfect. But what really makes it a success story is how much rigor, how focused, how much policy, fit for purpose policy, regulatory infrastructures, or the institutional arrangement that we put in place to drive the process. On paper, nothing really works. Certification is just the beginning of the real work. This is not the end. But by itself, it's a fundamental, remarkable step forward to ensure that this works for everybody. You are looking at the rules of origin that allows Africans to trade among themselves much more effectively, and that is going to protect Africans against abuses that may come from people within or rogue elements or trying to take advantage of some of the gaps that may be in the agreement. We need to be able to provide a level playing field that is transparent, that is predictable, that this allow monopoly. So we need to do this because this is the key to the industrialization, of course, to trading within the AfCFTA as an industrial tool.
The rollout of the CFTA is not only about removing barriers, it's removing barriers to trade between ourselves, but it's also about, at the same time, making clear the rules in terms of external engagement so that we don't have abuse, as you put it, and we don't have the entry of goods and so on that's not supposed to come in, and the rules of origin are an important part of that.